on the area where we were able to obtain a shanty, and I'll tell you why. My brother Bob began to run a low fever every day, and it didn't subside. He got a persistent cough, and the doctors discovered that he had tuberculosis. Now they didn't want us in the dormitories. And so the Lord provided through that, you know, and they forced us, and they made available a shanty, a rundown shack, 11 by 12, and they said, you must buy this. So Dad borrowed the money, $100, and here's our shack. Just fearfully and wonderfully built from all sorts of bits of material. This is the education building I was telling you about. And here Dad said, well, why bother to patch up the roof? I'll just make it run over it. And that, of course, provided a double roof, which was very good for air conditioning. This is our shack right here. And this is our picture window. And these things let down at night, and also during rainy weather. You can see how close the shanties were. And all this was sweet potato vine. No potatoes, but just the vine. This was our flower pot, which was an old cistern with a poinsettia growing in it. But we were mighty happy to have some place where we as a family could be together. Another shot of where our shanty was, looking down on it from the education building. Looking out our picture window, we stared into their picture window. And here's our neighbor on one side, happy couple. Very pleasant, always a pleasantry. And then on the other side, though, a happier couple with a couple small children. And they, as well as us, were very, very grateful to have a home by ourselves. I show you the picture again. This is Mom out picking bed bugs off the bedding. One of the problems was the lack of insecticide, so there's nothing to hold back the army of bed bugs that went from bed to bed, shack to shack. And Mom discovered that beds do not like sunshine, so on a sunny day, she'd take the bedding out, hang it over a line, and wait a little while, then all the bed bugs would crawl into the shady side. Then she'd quickly flip it over and smack all at once and try to get them off. So that's the way we had to live. One of the greatest worries we had in Manila was the shortage of water. Manila had been bombed, and not enough to go around for 4,000 internees. These troughs show how people wash their laundry, their hair, their babies, their dishes, all done outdoors. Be very disconcerting. You'd be there washing your dishes, and there'd be a man next to you upstream washing his socks, and the water would come down through your dishes. You don't appreciate a simple thing like a water faucet like we have here in America until you don't have one. Hard to imagine not to have enough water to be sanitary, to take a decent bath, and to wash your hair. But we were grateful for what little water we had. Mother's job in the camp was to make these cartoons on a large blackboard. They would be mounted over the chow lines, and as people came to get their chow, they would get a chuckle from these cartoons that depicting camp life. And it wasn't long before people started making a pilgrimage to the camp chow lines, not only to get their chow, but to see the new cartoon that went up every week. She would make one and change it every week. And they talked among themselves, and they said, who is this KF that is lifting our morale by these cartoons? I show you this one because this depicts camp conditions. Now, this man represents us. His name is Joe Internee. And he is fed up. He's certainly eager to graduate from the University of Hard Knocks. And so he's writing a letter to his uncle, Uncle Sam, of course. This is an urgent invitation to attend my graduation. Only your presence can make this experience of my life a complete success. We're asking America to come save us. Here are some of the dates that we thought we'd be liberated, but we're not. Notice some of the volumes, How to Get Fat on H2O by Professor Nipponese, Japan. How to Acquire a Love for Telinum. Telinum was that greens I told you about, like a slimy spinach leaf. Horrible stuff, but very nutritious, I guess. At least that's what the folks told me. Nipa Shack building. And, well, the Japanese guards would come up and look at these pictures and try to censor them, and they'd scratch their heads and wonder what they meant. They see us all enjoying them, think we're crazy. They made no sense to them, but to the internees, they made a lot of sense. And they Internees talked about them as being a tremendous morale booster, especially toward the last. Very interesting that in January of 44, Dad and Mom and some of the other conservative missionaries, isn't it interesting that among 400 missionaries in this camp, there was just a handful of ones that believed the Bible like you and I do. Some of the rest of them were very liberal, modernistic, and had no use for the Scripture nor for the deity of Jesus Christ. So Mom and Dad arranged, along with some others, to have an evangelistic campaign. And here's what she writes, which was very interesting to me. It was an honest effort to reach those sin-sick and careworn internees with the good news of the Savior. Yet it was surprising how indifferent the majority were to the Word of God, just as they are in America today. But their disregard was hard to understand in light of the dangers we were all facing and the needs and the possible death that they knew that we might come around the corner. God's name was used in scorn and blasphemy. Isn't that interesting that even with that kind of pressure shows you the hardness of man's incurable heart, doesn't it? Well, that was very interesting, but that was a real effort of my folks to be a witness even in that situation. Behind our shanty was the carpenter's bench where Dad used his carpentry skills to make toys, to make baby buggies, to make carts, to make deck chairs for other people, and we would exchange them for other things that we needed. So that workbench was a very important thing to help us with our keeping our family alive. Now here is our shanty again, but I point out this shanty right here, the one to the left, occupied by a man and his wife, youngish man, late 20s maybe, early 30s, a beautiful baby daughter, and he was in the black market. And so he had access to extra foodstuffs when the Japanese tightened down. The Japanese army began to lose the war by this time, and they reduced our diet, so no longer any breakfast, only 2 meals a day, and the noon meal would be a little cup of that tillenin, that spinach water, and then very thin rice gruel, and then at night, same thing. And but Mr. Brooks, our neighbor, he had underground smuggling supply connections, and so he was able to get food when all the rest of us were starving. Well, I remember sitting one noon meal, and we were eating our rice gruel and spinach water, and he's behind us, and he's cooking bacon and eggs and ham. And that smell comes wafting over, and we're just eating this terrible stuff. And Bob and I did not understand why we had to eat this horrible stuff and why we had to smell that good cooking over there. And we complained to our parents, aren't we Christians? Yes. Aren't we missionaries, which is extra credit? Yes. Well, how come that man who doesn't love Jesus behind us, he has bacon and eggs and ham, and we have to eat this tasteless gruel? Well, it was a tough question for the parents to answer. Their stock answer was, well, now God has not promised to meet our wants but our needs, and what you need now is that spinach water, so drink it. Until one day God answered it for us. One afternoon, a Japanese guard came rushing. We were just ready to finish up our meal of our rice gruel. He comes rushing in with a drawn, nickel-plated revolver, waving in our face. Where Mr. Brooks? Where Mr. Brooks? You Mr. Brooks? Well, up to that point, we wanted to be in Mr. Brooks' shoes. Now, for the first time, we were glad we weren't Mr. Brooks. We said, no, Mr. Brooks is back of us. And that man they were looking for was the man who was in the black market, that neighbor, and that commandant had heard about his black market dealings, and they arrested him and his wife and put he and a small child and family in solitary confinement, and they almost died of starvation because they'd been used to the richer foods, and they were put on a diet even worse than ours. Well, I'll tell you, that was a real lesson for Bob and I. We did not complain anymore. We ate the rice gruel and the spinach water with glee. Medical science is trying to please by installing new stomachs for internees. Cast iron stomachs are guaranteed to digest anything under any circumstances. People by this time were going through the camp looking for any greenery, canna lilies, hibiscus leaves, and people would boil them up with a pinch of salt, and boy, some of us got real sick. Some of the stuff was not edible. And this man says, well, how does it feel, Joe? And Joe says, swell, it only hurts when I bow. By this time, the Japanese guards thought that we Yanks needed a lesson in Oriental manners, and that we did not show enough gratitude for our benefactor guardians who were keeping us and feeding us. And so they had us line up in sections on this great big plaza once a day, and when the Japanese commandant strode by, he would stop, and then our section leader would say, ready, 1, 2, 3, bow. And all of us would bow from the waist very formally to our Japanese guard. Later on, people got so weak that some of the older folks, when they bowed, they crumpled and never came back up. Here is Dad dressed in his Sunday best. And the pants used to be long, but they wore off at the knees, and so we cut them off there and used the bottom material to patch the top and the pockets. And sometimes it got as heavy as 6 layers. You can tell he's in his best because he's got shoes and socks on. These socks Mother knitted from pieces of string she found and collected around the camp, from bamboo needles which he whittled. And these socks would not stay up. They had no stretching them whatsoever, but they were dress-up socks just the same. Dad has just come back from a chow line that looks like this. This you had to stand in a daily activity twice a day. And you better be there early because sometimes later on they used to run out of food. During the rainy months, which are 6 months, this is kind of a soggy group. That's the way it would look when it rained. And this is Dad coming back from that chow line with his special rain hat. One thing about it, missionaries didn't have to keep up with their style in this particular place. Did you notice that the usual container for food was a can with a wire handle? And Dad did not care for the way the wire handle hurt his hand, and so because we had to carry enough for 4, we usually only sent one of us. It was nice to have a family of 4 because we could take turns. We wouldn't burn out the energy, and we had to conserve all we could get. So he made this special tray, and double-decker tray, and the shoes and the cans are out there being disinfected by the sun. These are the sweet potato vines that had no potatoes, but after a while we started boiling up our own sweet potato leaves. They weren't poisonous and we weren't sick, but they tasted like old, moldy spinach leaves. It filled our stomachs, but it was not exciting. The shoes, Mother and I were able to wear alternately at that time, and we can't do that anymore. This is Mother dressed up in a very special dress made for a special occasion. She's standing over her native pottery stove, which you had to keep fanning constantly to keep it burning. And she's wearing clogs, these clogs which later on caught on here in the States as a very important piece of footwear. While the food situation became more and more serious, Americans began winning the war, and Mother sold her accordion and with it bought a couple of extra cups of rice. One accordion for 2 cups of rice. She sold her wedding rings and bought another can of carnation concentrated milk for my brother's tuberculosis. Dad borrowed $500 from another internee, Japanese money, which they used to call Mickey Mouse money, and that was to be paid back after the war. And with it he bought 10 one-pound cans of powdered milk. And that meant that we could have 1 cup of milk for each of us boys for as long as it lasted, $500. And most of the back salary when the folks got back to the States went to pay for the IOUs. And everybody was glad to lend you money because it was lent on this Japanese money, and then when you got back here, you had to pay it back with real money. But when you are starving, you do what you can. Bob and I wanted to help our part to help to find extra food. And remember I told you about the 75 Japanese guards that lived in that educational building? Well, they once a day they would come out with a big old woven basket with garbage in it, and they would dump it in this big old drum, and as soon as he turned his back and went back in, Bob and I brought our baskets and dived in head first and salvaged anything edible. Leaves, potato peelings, some of that greenery, celery stalks. One day even, we had a great feast. They dumped in fish heads. We took it all home. You boil it up and add it to our soup. So it made our little soup and our rice gould extra special. But other kids caught on that we were getting extra food. So this picture doesn't show it, but you can see them starting to come in, and they all gathered with their baskets. As soon as the guard turned his back, all of us dived in. There was a big bedlam. People were fighting for pieces of stuff, and the guard didn't like that. So the next day he came out with his tray of garbage, a brown paper bag, big smile. He put in the garbage, dumped the contents of the brown paper bag on top, which was the clippings and the sweepings off the barbershop floor. Thought that would discourage us. But you know, we can wash off hair. And we took the stuff home and boiled it up just the same. Next day he came out with manure from the cow, put that on top, can wash off manure. Third day he came out with kerosene. That was it. Can't wash it off. This is my brother Bob, I think now 11, he's about, what, 7 or 8. This is me about 11 and a half. I stayed 50 pounds with those 2.5, 3 years in need of good nourishment. Sure, I didn't have a formal education because, you see, when we were first interned, it was like a medieval city. If you came in and you had this skill or that skill, you sort of set up shop. So we had school teachers, and for a while we had regular classes. And Dad would do his carpentry, other people would do shoes. But after a while, everybody got so weak, and all the air raids and so forth, and after a while, nobody could do anything, so school stopped. But my practical education did not. I learned how to spy on Japanese soldiers without being seen, who were practicing their banzai attack right outside the wall of our camp. They had a wood wall. They painted black figures on there, and then with their rifles and great big bayonets, they would go banzai, and they rushed toward that wall, pow into that wall. And they didn't want us watching, but we watched, and I learned how to do that. Not many American kids know how to do that, and I had a very practical education. By the way, we wondered why. One day toward the end, they confiscated all the rake handles, and all the hoe handles, and all the broom handles. Next Sunday, I'll tell you what we found afterwards. I also learned to make my own toys when I was